Section 6 of The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories by Thomas Wallace Knox. Jugglers of the Orient. From time immemorial, the Far East has been famous for the performance of its jugglers. Anciently, they were supposed to have supernatural aid, and even at the present time, a large part of the native population regards them as something more than ordinary mortals. The travellers of 2 or 3 centuries ago gave the most wonderful accounts of what they saw the jugglers accomplish. The performances they described are so marvellous that they severely tax our credulity and lead us to speculate as to the reliability of the narrators. One traveller says that he saw a necromancer throw a coil of rope upward into the air. The rope stretched out as it ascended and remained fixed as though fastened to an invisible beam. The spectators could not see the upper end of the rope, as it was beyond the range of vision, and none of them was provided with an opera glass. Then the conjurer ordered a boy, who assisted him, to mount the rope, and he did so until he disappeared from sight. The conjurer called out to the boy several times, and receiving no reply, pretended to be very angry. Grasping a knife and holding it between his teeth, he climbed the rope, and in a little while there were sounds of voices, as though there was a quarrel. Then a hand of the boy fell to the ground, followed by the other hand, and then a foot, and the other foot, and then the head, and finally the trunk, all covered and dripping with blood. A moment later the conjurer slid down the rope. Blood was upon his garments, and he was panting as though much exhausted. The dismembered boy was gathered together and laid upon the ground, each limb in its proper place, and then the conjurer said something in a low tone, which was supposed to be an incantation of some sort. He waved a wand 2 or 3 times, and there was a movement of the juvenile fragments, and then the boy rose to his feet and ran about, being apparently as well as ever. The Emir, before whom the performance was given, sat quite unconcerned. The visitor felt disturbed about the stomach and heart, but was relieved by a cordial which was brought to him by the Emir's servants. He regarded the affair as something dreadful, but the Emir expressed the belief that there had never been no going up or down the rope, neither marring nor mending of the boy. It is said that this identical trick, or a modification of it, has been performed in modern times, but though I made diligent inquiry in China and India, and offered to pay a good price to witness it, I was unable to find a conjurer who would undertake it. Whenever I inquired, I was told it could be seen somewhere else. In Madras I was told it was performed in Delhi or Bombay, and in each of those places I was referred to the other, or to Madras or Calcutta. Ibn Battuta, the Arab traveller who gives the foregoing account, must have been something that is unknown to the conjurers of today, if he saw anything at all, and the same must be said of other tales of travellers of former days. But the fact remains that some of the performances of the conjurers or jugglers of today are nearly as marvellous as this, and have never been satisfactorily explained. Prominent among these is the boy and basket trick, which I had the pleasure of seeing soon after landing in India. Just after luncheon one day a servant came and said there was a juggler outside who could do something remarkable, and begged the permission of our party to honour us with a performance. As we had nothing to occupy us for an hour or more, and besides desired to see what the fellow could do, we consented at once. He was admitted to the courtyard of the hotel, where there were several reclining chairs, and thither we went at once. Seated on the chairs, we formed a circle of perhaps 20 feet in diameter. Behind us stood our native servants, and a goodly number of the attachés of the hotel. For them the performance was free, as the foreign spectators were expected to pay all the bills of the performer. The fellow began by displaying a quantity of puzzles, which were for sale, with the understanding that whoever purchased anything would be shown how to work it. There were rings curiously put together, buttons upon strings with complicated knots, and several other things of the same kind. We bought a few of the articles more to encourage the trade than because we wanted them, as they were in no way superior to the tricks that may be bought in London or New York. After a while we hinted, through one of the servants, that it was time for the performance to begin, and that we should buy nothing more until it was over. The courtyard of the hotel was paved with stone, and one of us examined the place very closely to see there was no trap-door in the centre where the conjurer took up his position. He was dressed in the ordinary costume of a native, and was a thin and rather oldish man, with a complexion like that of a dark mulatto. The tools of his trade were carried in a bag, and this bag was in a basket. The latter was shaped something like an inverted saucer, and measured about 30 inches from one side to the other. The basket was an ordinary affair, and we had an opportunity to examine it carefully. The mouth was 10 or 12 inches across, and it had no other opening. It was placed on the ground by the side of where the conjurer squatted, the bag of implements having been first taken out and the contents spread on the ground. There were a short sword, a few balls, 2 or 3 knives, and some of the tricks and puzzles such as we had just purchased, and there was also a flute, and this the performer picked up and placed to his mouth. He played a weird sort of tune, and while he was playing, the boy crept into the basket and coiled himself out of sight. There was just room enough for him and no more, and just as he had disappeared, the conjurer called out to him as though giving a command. There was no response, and then the conjurer called again. Still no response. And then the conjurer called in a louder tone. He then became very angry, at least he appeared to, and springing to his feet, bent over the basket and talked rapidly and violently as though in a state of frenzy. The boy responded in the same tones, and there was every indication of a quarrel between master and servant, and a quarrel, too, of no ordinary character. What was said on either side we did not know, as none of us were familiar with the language, and there was no time to give attention to interpreters. The man became wrought up to such a pitch of excitement that he seemed ready for any violent deed. Suddenly he seized the short sword which lay near him, and plunged it into the basket. Some of the spectators gave a slight cry of horror, but most of them realized they were watching a conjurer, and had no occasion for alarm. But think as we might, the spectacle was fearful, and it seemed impossible that the boy could be otherwise than killed. The master was apparently frantic with rage. He gave lunge after lunge at the basket, driving the sword through it and down to the floor of the courtyard. Here, there, and everywhere he drove it, and we could see all over the surface of the basket the great gashes made by the weapon. At the first blow the boy shrieked in a way that made all the listeners shudder. It was a shriek exactly like what might be expected under the circumstances. Each blow was followed by a similar sound until several blows had been given, and then the sound grew fainter and fainter, and at last there was no response. How could there be any when the boy was certainly pierced by a dozen wounds, any one of which must be fatal? From sheer exhaustion the conjurer stopped and sat down on the ground. He wiped the blood-covered sword and placed it with the other utensils of his trade, and then he turned to the basket and looked into it. In apparent astonishment he held it up before us and found that it was empty. And then he gave it to one of the servants, who passed it around the circle that we might see for ourselves how much it had suffered from the blows of the knife. Certainly as a basket it was of no further use. What had become of the boy? We all saw him enter the basket, heard the altercation between him and his master, heard his shrieks as the sword was thrust into the frail piece of wickerwork, and heard, to make an Irish bull, his silence afterward. But nobody had seen him come out of the basket, and every one of us had kept his eyes glued to it from the moment he crept inside. Even if he had left the basket, there was no way for him to get out of our circle without being perceived, as we were seated so closely that our chairs almost touched each other, and he could not possibly escape unseen. And we were further satisfied that there was no trap-door by which he could descend. While we were speculating as to his disappearance, the boy suddenly reappeared behind my chair and pressed forward to enter the circle. He came from somewhere, but from where nobody in our party knew, and the secret of how he escaped none of us could guess. But there he was, and no mistake, and he was as free from scar or wound as when he entered the basket. We might examine him as closely as we liked and satisfy ourselves that he was quite unharmed. It is not at all difficult to explain everything except the escape of the boy from the basket and outside the ring. The conjurer, when using the sword, made his thrusts in such a way as to avoid touching the boy. I afterwards saw this trick performed by a bungler, and observed that he thrust the sword straight down in the centre of the basket, or else directed the weapon so that it passed over the youth. In this second instance, the latter part of the trick, the escape was not given, and this is the part for which nobody has yet found a satisfactory explanation. Another remarkable trick of the Indian jugglers is that of the mango, a fruit not altogether unlike the banana, though vastly superior in flavour. The mango tree is cultivated from the seed, and the performer who undertakes this trick has no other paraphernalia than a pot of earth and a few seeds of the luscious fruit. He usually has an assistant, although not always, and whenever he has one of the duties of the latter are confined to playing the flute or some other musical instrument. The East is a land where one must be patient, and the rule applies to jugglery as well as to everything else. I was told that I must sit quietly in my chair during the entire performance, which would take at least an hour, and I must not be surprised if it required 2 hours. Bear in mind, said my informant, that it takes several years for the mango tree to reach the fruit-bearing stage, and you ought to be satisfied when you see it come to maturity in a couple of hours. So I prepared to be patient, and patience was easy enough just after the luncheon hour, when the temperature was altogether too hot to permit one to do anything out of doors. The performance took place on the paved courtyard of the hotel, and the surroundings were practically the same as in the trick of the boy and the basket. Even had there been a trap-door, it would have availed nothing, as it could have been of no advantage in producing a tree. In the presence of all the spectators, the conjurer took a mango seed in his fingers and planted it in a pot or tub of earth. We were permitted to examine the earth and to stir it with a stick to make sure there was nothing else there. The seed was planted, the earth was watered, and then the performer and his assistant played upon their instruments some of the music for which the East is noted. It was weird and melancholy, and one of the spectators remarked that it was enough to make any respectable tree get out of the ground and go away as soon as possible. For 10 minutes or more there was no change in the appearance of the earth where the seed was planted, but at the end of that time it was seen to swell, and the shoot of the young plant made its appearance. It rose slowly with a steady motion, requiring what seemed to be 2 or 3 minutes for every inch of growth. A few inches from the ground the shoot separated into branches, then the leaves appeared, and then the trunk took the shape of a veritable tree trunk. And every spectator familiar with the appearance of the mango tree could recognize it at a glance. The leaves grew to their natural size, and in the centre of each cluster of leaves there came a panicle of reddish-white flowers peculiar to this tree. The flowers withered, and the fruit appeared, grew to its natural size, and was ready to be gathered. The mango tree varies from 20 to 40 feet in height, and its branches spread as widely as those of an apple tree in the northern states of America. It affords a grateful shade, and would be highly valued for this reason alone, even if it did not afford the fruit which is so greatly prized. It is proper to say that the mango trees produced by the Oriental conjurers are not of full size. They are limited to a height of a few feet, but to all appearance they are perfect in shape. The last act of the performance is to cut off the fruit and hand it around to be eaten. No, the last act is to collect from the spectators the amount that each chooses to pay for having witnessed such a wonderful manifestation of the necromancer's skill. The conjurers do not confine themselves to producing the mango tree alone. They will bring forth several of the well-known trees of India, but the mango is their favorite. The Chinese jugglers have a trick which is a combination of the two which we have just described. The juggler has a boy to aid him, and the boy is supposed to be, and generally is, his own son. He quarrels with the boy and kills him, having previously planted a melon seed on the spot where the boy falls. He dismembers the boy, throws the pieces together, and covers them with a blanket. In a little while the blanket is raised, and it is found that the boy has quite disappeared. In his place is a melon, which has grown from the seed that was planted in the ground, though sometimes the planting is done in a flower pot filled with loose earth. Then one of the bystanders, possibly a confederate, asks that the melon shall be made to disappear as the boy did. The blanket is again thrown on the ground and raised after an interval of a few minutes. The melon has disappeared, and there is absolutely nothing under the blanket. It is again dropped and raised, and there is the boy, safe and unharmed, and ready to accept the coin which is thrown into the ring. Many of the tricks of the Chinese jugglers have been seen in America, as the Chinese have no great objections to traveling, and will readily negotiate for foreign tours. But the ease is different with the jugglers of India. No good performer can by any means be induced to cross the black water, as the sea is called, and though the most liberal offers have been made to them, they have steadily refused. Neither will they sell the secret of their tricks to foreigners, and it is for this reason that no one has yet found an explanation of the basket trick or that of the mango. The common performers are ready enough to dispose of what is not worth the purchase, but those of the higher class are entirely different. It is said that the best tricks of the conjurers have descended from father to son through many generations, and are kept with the greatest care. Jugglery was practiced among the ancient Egyptians, and has continued in the land of the Pharaohs down to the present time. Among the ancients it was associated with sorcery, and this has been the case in all countries and in all ages amongst the most ignorant class of the people. A favorite trick of the Egyptian jugglers at the present time is to be tied naked in a bag that is apparently empty when they enter it. After a time they emerge with garments covering them, and bearing plates and baskets of food in their hands. During my first visit to Egypt I saw a juggler that would produce live chickens, rabbits, and snakes from an apparently empty shell, into which he blew before each production. He squatted on the ground, and had nothing in sight but the shell. 2 boys assisted him, but they were not once detected in passing anything into his hands. And then he caused an apparently empty box to become filled with pancakes, which he told his boys to eat. They refused to eat the cakes without honey, whereupon he picked up a jar which was empty, as was evident from his holding it bottom upward. As soon as he had reversed it, the jar was full of honey, and the boys then had their sauce for their cakes. When they had finished eating, they called for water to wash their hands, whereupon he caused the jar to be filled with pure water in the same way that it was filled with honey. Many of the so-called miracles of the priests of ancient Egypt, Greece, and other countries are now known to have been nothing else than sleight-of-hand tricks, and some of them were of a very clumsy character. The statues that spoke oracles were hollow, and the spirit voice, which was so highly revered, was simply that of a priest who was concealed in the figure. The vocal Memnon that greeted the first rays of the rising sun stands today where it stood 3,000 years ago, but in these modern times there is none so poor to do it reverence. Kings and princes travelled far and waited long that they might hear the supernatural sounds which are today evoked for ordinary mortals by the Arab guides, who gladly, for a trifling fee, climb to the lap of the sitting colossus and, quite concealed in its lap, repeat the tricks of the ancient priests of Isis. End of section 6. Section 7 of The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories by Thomas Wallace Knox. The Serf's Revenge. During the revolution in Poland in 1830-31, there were many Russians living near the Polish frontier who became more or less involved in the movement. Many of them sympathized with the Poles, and where they could not publicly take part in the revolution, they did so privately. Some gave money to the insurgent cause, and while they would not inform the government officials of any plans of the conspirators, they were ever ready to tell the latter what the government was doing against them. Their houses frequently gave concealment to the messengers of the Poles when pursued by the government scouts, and furnished convenient hiding places for refugees who found their own homes too hot to hold them. A great many proprietors of landed estates were suspected of disloyalty, though it was often difficult to prove it against them. They were able to conceal their true character in much the same way that some of the residents of the border states during our late war used to pretend to be on both sides of the political fence at the same moment, and favored the Union or the rebellion as best served their purpose. The government made a great many arrests among these frontier residents, and held investigations over their conduct. Some were discharged on giving proof of their loyalty, or on no evidence being found against them. Others were imprisoned on account of the suspicions against them, and when there was proof of their disloyalty, they were banished to Siberia. The banishment was in proportion to the extent of their offence, and varied all the way from a few years up to the duration of the natural life of the offender. Some were marched in chains over the long road into northern Asia, and frequently their journey lasted more than 2 years before they reached their destination. More distinguished prisoners were entitled to ride, and went forward day and night with great rapidity. Thus they travelled in a few weeks the road that the pedestrian prisoners were many months in passing to the end. Among the residents on the Russian frontier at that time was a nobleman named Doloff, who had served in his youth at the court of the Emperor at St. Petersburg. The atmosphere of the court did not suit him, and so after a few years he left the service and retired to his estate, where he hoped to live in peace. He formed an acquaintance with a few noblemen living near him, and made occasional visits to Warsaw whenever the solitude of his country place began to weary him. By and by the insurrection broke out, and speedily assumed the proportions of a revolution. Most of the Poles espoused the cause. Some of the Russians living on the frontier declared in their favour, and others against them, while still others, as before stated, remained or professed to remain neutral. Of this last number was Doloff. He argued that as he had served in the army and had always been thoroughly loyal to his emperor, the latter could need no special proof of his adhesion to the government cause. On the other hand, his estate was so near the frontier that if he pronounced emphatically in opposition to the rebellion, his life and property would be in great danger from the hostility of the Poles. He remained quietly at home, in attendance upon his affairs, and hoped to escape all troubles. Among the serfs on Dolaeff's estate, the master was not particularly popular. He was imperious and often cruel, and in the collection of the obrok, or annual dues, from such as had control of their own time, he was never merciful. He demanded always the last kopeck upon an agreement, and no plea of sickness, bad harvests, or low markets had any weight with him. Occasionally a serf was severely beaten at his order for some trifling offence, and he was never backward in demanding on all occasions the exercise of his full seignorial rights. Masters of this class were in about the same proportion among Russian noblemen under the system of serfdom as were men of the Legree stamp in the days of American slavery. No one, whatever his political faith, will deny that the world would be better off if it contained fewer of these petty tyrants. Ivan Stepanoff was one of the most intelligent serfs on the estate, and often assisted his fellow labourers in getting out of difficulties with each other or with their master. Dolaeff regarded him very favourably, and generally showed him more kindness than was his wont towards others. Ivan was prosperous in a worldly point of view, and on 2 or 3 occasions had relieved Dolaeff from financial embarrassments. But one day, after a heavy loss at cards, Dolaeff sent for Ivan, and asked him for a sum of money greater than he could command. Ivan protested that he had not the amount, and could not raise it. Dolaeff, in a fit of anger, struck his serf a blow that felled him to the ground, and then, kicking him in the side, he turned away, and just as he was getting out of earshot, he heard Ivan mutter, "I will have my revenge for this." A week later, Dolaeff was arrested on a charge of aiding the insurrection. It was shown that several rebels had been concealed in his house at different times, and that one, with whom he was particularly intimate, was the chief of a gang of conspirators whose place of meeting was at Warsaw. He was taken to the nearest government town, and in due time tried, found guilty, and sentenced to Siberia for life. Ivan was not to be found at the time of the arrest, and the master naturally attributed it to the revenge that his servant had promised to obtain for the blow and kick he received. Dolaeff was ordered to be taken to Siberia as rapidly as possible. He was kept a day or 2 in prison after his sentence, and then placed in a telyaga, or common country wagon, and started on his long journey eastward. By his side was a soldier to whom he was chained, while a postillion sat on the box with the driver, and allowed the latter to waste no time. They halted at the stations only long enough to change horses and obtain food. Occasionally the postillion and the soldier exchanged places so as to allow the former to obtain the sleep he could not easily get while sitting bolt upright on the box. The telyaga is an ordinary wagon mounted on wooden springs, which have very little elasticity, and where the roads are rough the jolting is very uncomfortable. To ease the motion a little, the traveller generally fills the vehicle with straw or hay, and lies half sitting and half reclining upon it. The horses are driven at the best of their speed, if the postillion demands it, as he generally does. Most travellers are anxious to proceed as rapidly as possible, in order that the journey may be ended at the earliest moment. Whether they are on pleasure or business, or going into exile, they are quite willing that their time on the road shall be brief. The exiles who go on foot rest every 3rd day, but those who ride make no delay. Very often the pedestrian prisoners ask to be allowed to go forward without these 3rd days of rest. But the request is not allowed, on account of the confusion it would make among the convoys of prisoners on the road. It is quite desirable that proper distances should be maintained between the travelling parties, so that no 2 of them shall be at the same station at once. The stations are strong buildings surrounded with palisaded fences, and generally a little distance from the villages. They are not very neatly kept, and in summer the prisoners prefer to camp on the ground and sleep in the open air, either in the station yard or outside of it. Dolouf's guard showed him every attention consistent with his duties, but as the guard is held to a strict responsibility in case of the escape of a prisoner, he could not allow him many privileges, or relax his vigilance towards him. Sometimes at the station he prolonged the halts more than was necessary for refreshment and the change of horses, but he could not allow many delays of this kind, lest the increase of time over the usual length of the journey should attract attention. The postilion looked upon the journey much as his prisoner did, and often bemoaned his fate in being assigned to that duty. "Poor wretch that I am," said he, "I am going to Siberia as well as you, and it may be months before I am able to return. What if I should be forgotten and allowed to stay there for years?" Day by day and night by night they rolled along. They passed Moscow, the holy Moscow, beloved by every true Russian and venerated by the subjects of the Tsar with a feeling akin to that which every true Moslem regards the birthplace of Mohammed. They skirted the banks of the Volga, and despite his mental depression at the thought that every step was bearing him further from home and nearer exile, Dolouf grew enraptured at the picturesque scenery which each turn of the road and river unfolded to his eye. Rough and huge bearded ferrymen carried them over its waters just as the domes and towers of Kazan glittered in the sunlight above the battlemented walls where 300 years ago the Tartar power was dominant, and only expelled after a long and bloody conflict and the loss of many Russian lives. They followed the lovely valley of the Kama till the peaks of the Ural Mountains rose into view like a wall built between European and Asiatic world. Climbing the wooded slopes, they passed the boundary and entered northern Asia. 2 hours later they halted at Ekaterinburg, the first city on the eastern slope of the mountains, and nestled in a charming position on the banks of the little river Iset. On and on they went among the foothills that every hour grew smaller until they reached the great Barabinsky steppe, which seemed to stretch away limitless as the ocean and apparently as trackless. Along the level steppe they galloped, with little to vary the monotony of their journey. Ferrying the Irtish and the Ob, those great rivers of western Siberia, passing town after town and village after village, they came at length to Irkutsk, the capital of eastern Siberia, when Dolouf was delivered into the hands of the official and his weary postilion released from further care. The prisoner, after a few days' rest, was appointed to settle as a colonist 1,000 miles to the northward, and once more his journey was resumed. When this destination was reached, his duties were assigned to him. With a fellow prisoner sentenced for the same cause and to a similar period of exile, he was assigned to the hard duties of a farmer in a new country. A quantity of land equal to about 50 acres was given to them in the valley of a small river, and they were at liberty to cut as much wood and timber as they pleased from the public domain that surrounded them. They were supplied with axes and all the other tools necessary for clearing their ground, building a house, and tilling the soil. The government gave them food and clothing, seed for planting their fields, and everything absolutely necessary to their subsistence for the first 2 years of their residence. At the end of that time they were expected to take care of themselves. Once a week the 2 prisoners were required to report to the starost, or head man of the village, 4 miles away. They endeavoured to plan an escape, but could see no possibility of leaving the country. The road was long, and it was more than 3,000 miles to European Russia, and at almost every step there were difficulties to be encountered. They had no passports, and without them no one can travel in Siberia. They could not pass in the disguise of peasants, as their language would betray them. They had no money for their expenses on the road, and would be certain of detection and severe punishment. So after canvassing the possibilities of escape, and finding the chances altogether against them, Dolaeff and his companion abandoned hope, and in the sadness of despair pursued their dreary labours as colonists in Siberia. After the arrest of his master, Ivan was drafted into the Russian service and assigned to a battalion of the army about to move upon Warsaw. Dolaeff's estate, like all the property of men convicted of treason, passed into the possession of the government and was managed in the interest of the crown. Ivan's battalion was not long in finding active service, and took part in the battles that had for their objective the capture of Warsaw. In the last attack upon the fortified capital in September of 1831, he distinguished himself by his skill and bravery, and was mentioned in the reports of his regimental commander as worthy of an officer's commission. The gulf between the Russian soldier and the Russian officer is a wide one. It cannot be easily crossed, but when a man has once left the ranks and passed that gulf, his promotion is comparatively easy. Ivan devoted his whole time and attention to his duties, and won the admiration of his superiors. Step by step he advanced. The battalion was ordered to St. Petersburg, and 4 years after his entry into the service, Ivan found himself on duty at the palace, and frequently under the eye of the emperor. Nicholas was pleased with him, and one day said to Ivan that he would grant any favour he might ask, provided it were not too great. Ivan busied himself a day or two in preparation of a paper, and then tremblingly presented it to the emperor. The latter glanced a moment at the document, frowned, and turned away. That evening a courier left the palace and hastened away eastward as fast as his horses could carry him. 4 months later he returned, and with him Dolaeff. They waited in the ante-room until Nicholas was ready to see them, and were summoned to his presence. "Your Majesty," said the courier, "I have brought the man for whom you sent me. This is Paul Dolaeff." "Send for the lieutenant of the guard," was the only response from the emperor. A messenger left the room, and in a few moments Ivan was brought before the Tsar, and into the presence of his old master. "You are pardoned," said Nicholas to Dolaeff, "and your estates, titles, and civil rights are restored to you. This meritorious officer, whom I promised to grant any favour he would ask, instead of seeking promotion, interceded in your behalf, and to him you owe your release." This was the revenge of Ivan Stepanoff. End of section 7. Section 8 of The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories by Thomas Wallace Knox. The Headhunters of Borneo. One of the odd customs of the island of Borneo, in the Malay archipelago, is that of head hunting. The settlement and permanent occupation of Borneo by Europeans have put an end to the practice in some quarters, especially along the sea coast, but a long time must elapse before it is entirely out of fashion among the savage tribes. The aboriginal inhabitants of Borneo are called Dyaks. They are scattered in towns and villages all over the island, those on the coast living chiefly by fishing, while those of the interior are engaged in agriculture, gold digging, camphor collecting, and other industries peculiar to the land. They belong to the Malay race, and are divided into tribes which differ considerably from each other, though there can be no doubt as to their common origin. Morally considered, they are superior to most of the Malays, and their principal vices are those they have obtained from intercourse with the Chinese and other foreigners. The coast Dyaks were formerly much given to piracy, which they followed as a regular industry, but it was long ago broken up by foreign ships of war. When a chief wished to engage in a piratical venture, he gathered his fighting men together, and then proceeded with his proas, or boats, to an island in some channel where native and other vessels were likely to pass. A camp would be established at the mouth of a river, or in a bay that afforded shelter, and whenever a vessel came within reach, the proas would dart out and capture her. If the crew were European, everybody was killed at once. If they were Malays, they were sold into slavery or held for ransom. Men who were otherwise honest and respectable indulged in piracy, and could not understand the prejudices of Europeans against it. Sometimes the heads of prisoners were cut off, and this was generally the case if the captors belonged to the head-hunting tribes. Even if they had no use for the heads on their own account, they found them useful as articles of trade with the interior Dyaks, generally called hill tribes, as the latter were nearly all head-hunters, and it is among them that the practice survives today. Head-hunting was a pursuit just as legitimate as that of slave-trading or piracy among the Dyaks, or that of collecting books or autographs among civilized people. Every man was taught from his infancy that the owner of every head which he cut off would be his servant in the next world, and the larger the number he could obtain, the greater would be his importance. No man could marry until he had obtained a human head. It was not absolutely necessary for him to secure it with his own hand, and therefore, when a man became of marriageable age, his friends often came to his aid, and went on a hunting expedition on his behalf. It was necessary that the head should come from the body of someone of another tribe, and therefore the hunting party went stealthily to the neighbourhood of another village than their own, and lay in wait by the side of the path till someone happened along whom they could decapitate. The head being obtained, they hurried home with the prize, which was as important in the Dyak wedding ceremonial as the ring is in a Christian one. When a man of importance died, he could not be buried until a head had been obtained, so as to ensure his having a servant to wait on him in the next world. When two tribes that have been at war had agreed upon terms of peace, each of them delivered to the other a victim, whose head was immediately cut off and kept as a souvenir of the treaty, serving in fact the same purpose as a written document. Sometimes the chiefs used to start out on raiding excursions solely for the purpose of obtaining a supply of heads. With a large force of fighting men, they surrounded villages, remained perfectly quiet for hours, and suddenly, at an early hour in the morning, set fire to the thatched huts, and speared or cut down the people as fast as they came in sight. Not one of the inhabitants would be allowed to escape. The heads of the men were cut off, and so were those of some of the women and children. Some of the latter, as were saved from death, were carried into slavery. The heads were dried and used for household ornaments, and the teeth were usually knocked out and strung into necklaces. None of the Dyaks could tell where the custom arose. It was mentioned in all the traditions of the tribes, and that was all they knew about it. One of my friends, who once made an excursion into the interior of Borneo, had an experience with the Dyak head-hunters which I will endeavour to tell as nearly as possible in his own words. He told it to me one afternoon in Singapore, while we were watching a group of Malays engaged in relieving a native boat of its curious cargo of birds, beeswax, camphor, and other products of the archipelago. "It happened a great many years ago," said he, "when I was much younger and far less cautious than I am now. I did not believe half of the stories that had been told me of the head-hunters, and when cautioned about venturing among them, I laughed at the suggestion. I was on a schooner that traded along the coast, and was very favourably impressed with the Dyaks that we met. They were far more honest than most other of the Malay race, and also more robust and vigorous. The men were finely formed, and the women were prettier than most of the Orientals. There was one Dyak lady, the wife of a Chinese merchant at Sinkawan, who would have taken the prize at a beauty show, beyond a doubt. She was much lighter in colour than most of the Malays, and had long eyelashes and a complexion like a peach. The Dyak women have a habit of keeping their eyes half closed, and this adds to their beauty, at least to most Europeans. Many of the Chinese in Borneo are married to Dyak wives, and they told me that a Dyak woman prefers a Chinese husband to one of her own race, for the reason that the Chinese husband will work to support her, while a Dyak will not. At Sinkawan I met some Dyaks from the interior who had brought down a quantity of fine gold dust, which they readily sold to the Chinese traders. I had a fancy for going into the hill country, as I thought it would be a novel sort of adventure, and perhaps I might pick up some of the dust that had been the object of man's cupidity ever since the world began, or at any rate ever since the value of gold became known. A young English sailor whom I met at Sinkawan offered to go with me, and we soon patched up a partnership. The schooner was to go to another port, and then return to Sinkawan, and I thought I should have ample time for the journey. Part of the way we were to go in boats on a river, and the rest by walking overland. Jack, my sailor friend, knew something of the language of the Dyaks, and I could speak a few words. We engaged 2 Chinese to go with us, and then made terms with the Dyaks who were to accompany us to their home and show us where the gold was found. We promised that if they did so we would give them a liberal quantity of the goods that they most desired, provided, of course, we were brought safely back to the coast. The ordinary incidents of the journey you will not care about. Everything went well so far as the attentions of our escort were concerned, but we found it very tough work to travel in the native paths. These people all go barefooted, and they put one foot in front of the other, so that the paths in course of time are worn into channels 5 or 6 inches deep and just the width of one's foot. Our shoes were so wide and inelastic that they stuck in the channels, and we had not gone many miles before the soles had been quite torn from the uppers. Then we wrapped our feet in cloths like moccasins, but they did not afford much protection, and we were very soon a weary and footsore pair. But we trudged on, determined to get to the gold mines, though more than once we were on the point of turning back in despair. When we stopped at night, the Dyaks made little huts in which we all slept, 2 in a hut, and we had the sides closed in very tight to keep out the snakes, which were numerous in that part of the island. We lived on rice, which was carried by every member of the party excepting Jack and myself, and it seemed like magic the way the Dyaks and Chinese prepared their rice whenever we came to a halt. They steamed it over a fire instead of boiling it as we do, and they made it so light that every grain was separate by itself. The 3rd night after leaving the river we went to sleep as usual, but along after midnight Jack was waked by something crawling over him. He yelled "Snake!" and jumped up, and as he did so he almost upset our little shelter. By the time he got to his feet he found that the supposed snake was only one of the green twigs that held the hut together, and after swearing a while about it he lay down again. Of course he had waked me up completely, so that I couldn't get to sleep again. I lay awake an hour or more, and as the place was rather stuffy I opened the top a little and peeped out through the chinks, and then opened the entrance, thinking to go outside. The moon was in its last quarter, and the stars were in the sky, but moon and stars could only very dimly light the dense forest where we were. I thought I saw something moving among the trees, but concluded it was only a shadow, and then I saw it again and felt more certain, and very soon I made out the form of a man creeping up toward one of the Dyak shelters, and then I knew what it was. We were surrounded by a party of head hunters, and they were bent on taking our lives. Jack hadn't got fairly to sleep, and I whispered to him and said, The headhunters were after us. We had chaffed each other so much about them that he thought I was joking. It was the old story of the boy that cried wolf when no wolf was about. Jack said all the fellows wanted was our heads, and they wouldn't trouble us afterward, provided we gave up our skulls without making a fuss. And then I spoke to him a second time in a low but very earnest whisper, and I not only spoke, but I grabbed him by the arm. He knew by this that I was in earnest, and was on his feet very quickly. Each of us had a revolver, and knew how to use it, but in the dim light it was impossible to take good aim, and we didn't want to throw away any shots. There were a dozen or more of the rascals creeping up to the huts, and each of them had a coal with which to set fire to our shelters. But these shelters are not dry like the huts in the villages, being made principally of green stuff, and it wasn't likely they would burn very fast. The fellow that came up to our hut stooped down to light a fire as near the ground as possible, and luckily he was on the side away from the entrance. Jack was a powerful young chap, and he sneaked around outside and jumped on the scoundrel, clutching him by the throat at the same time so that he never made a sound. He strangled him in less than 2 seconds, or more likely broke his neck. At the same time I trampled out the fire, and then we were ready to attend to some of our other visitors. We drew our pistols and went for them, and we made lively work, you may believe. We shot down 5 of our assailants before they could rise to their feet, and then we got 2 more of them before they knew what we were about. The sound of the firearms scared all that we did not hit, and they made the best possible time into the forest, though not until one of them gave Jack a very ugly cut with a knife. The Dyaks had no firearms, and at that time they had an idea that there was no limit to the distance a bullet would go. The fight was over in less time than I'm telling about it, and our people came out of their huts almost crazy with fright. There was no more sleeping that night. The next morning our Dyak friends cut off the heads of the men that had fallen under our bullets, and also the head of the one that Jack choked to death. Jack's wound and our sore feet made it unadvisable for us to go further. The Dyaks were so grateful to us for our double service, saving their own heads and supplying them with such a good stock to carry home, that they escorted us back to the coast, and would take nothing for their compensation. They gave each of us a knife or sword of Dyak manufacture, to keep as a memento of the trip. Mine is one of the finest bits of steel you ever saw, and has a blade about 2 feet long. I have cut a large nail in 2 with it, and the edge was not harmed in the least, and I have heard that these knives will cut through the barrel of a musket when wielded by a strong man. Come around to my lodgings, and I'll show you my souvenir of that trip. New York Ledger. End of chapter 8.
Section 9 of The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Danny Hogger, DannyHogger.com. The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories by Thomas Wallace Knox. A fight with a tiger. Apt Evans invited me to go to his tea plantation up country and stay as long as I liked, and by way of allurement he promised me a tiger hunt. "You can have it any way that suits you," said he, "from a Maichan to a Batu with elephants, but in the latter case you will have to stand the expense, as my purse won't afford it, and a tidy bit of expense it will be. Just before I came down to Calcutta I heard of a man-eater about 50 miles from my place, and if you say the word, we'll try for his hide and the government reward." "You will be safe enough if you hunt from a Maichan," said the captain, "a mode of entertainment that is practiced more by the native princes than by Europeans. They have stands, or stone towers, Maichans, erected along a valley where a tiger is likely to run when driven out of the jungle. The hunters get into those stands and then send the beaters to drive the game out of its place of concealment. As the tigers run along the valley, they are shot, and the men who shoot them, or at them, are perfectly safe from attack. I never tried this form of hunting but once, and then it was at the invitation of a native prince. I killed the tiger as he was trotting leisurely along the valley, and not 50 yards in front of me, killed him at the first shot. When satisfied that he was dead, I went out with the attendants to bring him in, and I found that the beast had a collar around his neck with my host's name on it. The polite prince had let the tiger loose so that our hunt should not be without result. The captain was just starting to give an account of the battue with elephants and also of a hunt on foot when his friend the major interrupted him. "Tell us more about your 10 minutes with the tiger in Mysore," said the major. "There's a story of a creature that was very famous in his day." "Yes, he was," replied the captain, "but I must have a fresh cigar before I tell about him." Suiting the action to the word, he lighted a Havana, which the major preferred, settled back onto his chair, was silent for a few moments, and then began his narration. "I was serving in the Fusiliers, and my detachment had been 2 or 3 months in Mysore, the capital of the district of the same name, when word came that there was a man-eater at work about 100 miles to the east of the city, supposed to be at the same time that had been in the southern part of the district for a year or more. I obtained leave to go for him. Thompson asked for leave at the same time and got it, and away we went together. Poor old Thompson. Little did he think it was to be his last hunt. We took along our favorite shikari huntsman, who had been with us in several hunts and knew his business. He gathered a party of about 40 beaters, and while getting them together, he made diligent inquiries as to where the tiger had last been seen. He hadn't been heard of anywhere for several days, and so we determined to wait for fresh news before starting out. We hadn't long to wait, for the very evening that Shikari had finished organizing his party, this tiger carried off a young woman who was walking along a path not 50 yards from the village where she lived. 2 men were not more than a dozen yards behind her when the beast sprang out from under a corinda bush, seized the woman by the neck, and carried her off as easily as though she had been a partridge or a rabbit. By daylight the next morning we were on his track and followed it for half a mile to where, at the side of a great rock, he had devoured all he cared to of the body of his victim. Poor girl! She was to have been married that day week. At any rate, that's what the headman at the village told us. Half a mile further on there was a patch of jungle, and the shikari tracked the beast quite near its edge and was satisfied that our game was concealed somewhere in the thicket. Our party was not large enough to surround the jungle, and we sent to the neighboring villages and obtained as many men as we could to act as beaters and frighten the animal out so that we could get a shot at him. I was about to ask why they did not go directly into the jungle and shoot him in his lair. The captain anticipated my inquiry, as he immediately continued. "If we had wanted to commit suicide, we would have gone into the jungle and hunted the fellow out. It is a very unsafe thing to do, as the tiger sees you long before you can possibly see him, and if he has no good way of escape, he will turn the tables on you without asking your leave. Almost from under your feet he will rise and make a spring at you, and there is rarely time to use your rifle as he comes in. Many a hunter has left his bones in India by following a tiger into the jungle, and especially by going there in pursuit of one that he has wounded." In little more than an hour we had the jungle surrounded by the beaters. Thompson and I selected our stands about 50 yards apart, where he thought the beast would try to escape, and then the signal was given for the beaters to begin. They made a great noise with drums and tom-toms. They threw stones into the thicket, and every little while they fired off their old muskets to add to the tumult. On the side where Thompson and I were stationed, there were no noise, as we wanted the tiger to believe that all the danger lay where the racket was being made, and so he would run in our direction. The man-eater came out of the jungle, not creeping stealthily as we had expected, but making great bounds into the air at the top of his speed. Thompson fired, and so did I, but neither of our shots were fatal, though both took effect. With a roar that seemed to shake the ground, the brute turned and sprang at Thompson, sprang upon him and threw him to the ground, and then grasped him by the throat and shook him as a cat shakes a mouse. I dared not fire for fear of hitting my friend, but I stood with my rifle ready for a shot the moment the tiger should drop his victim. Thompson made no movement. Quite likely he was killed by the first blow of the tiger or stunned by the fall, and if not then stunned, he was certain to have been rendered insensible by the shaking he received. The habit of all animals of the cat species to shake their prey is really a merciful one, as it stupefies them and so renders death painless. Several hunters who have been rescued from the jaws of the tiger have said that they were without sensation after the beast had shaken them in the way I have told you. The tiger dropped Thompson and raised its head, and then I fired in the hope of making a deadly shot. Then the beast turned on me, and I got in another shot which stopped it for a moment, just long enough for me to spring into the branches of a small tree under which I was standing. In springing there, I dropped my rifle, and so found myself without a weapon other than the knife at my belt. The tiger tried to reach me in the tree. He might have done so had not one of his 4 legs been shattered by a bullet, probably the last one I fired. There was a great gash across his head, but it was only a skin wound, the thick skull having glanced away the bullet like the side of a gunboat. Then there was a wound across his back, but I could easily see that it was not serious. A tiger will stand a great deal of lead in him, and, on the other hand, he is easily killed if you can only touch certain parts. He crouched at the foot of the tree when he found he could not reach me, and there he lay growling, lashing his tail from side to side, and every few moments giving a roar that could be heard for a long distance. If I had not lost my rifle, I could have settled him very quickly, but to attack him with a knife would have been madness, and my only hope was in the shikaree hearing the roar and coming out to my aid. I knew none of the other natives would venture in the vicinity, and already most of them had quite likely taken to their heels and fled to their villages. The shikaree came as I hoped and expected. As he approached, I indicated by signs for him to take Thompson's rifle, which was more effective than his own, and finish the beast. He nodded compliance, took the rifle from the ground where it lay, filled the magazine from the pouch of cartridges on the body of my dead comrade, and then, while I held the attention of the tiger by making menacing motions and pretending that I was about to descend to the ground, the hunter crept within 20 yards of the tree and stretched the animal lifeless with a bullet through his heart. Another bullet followed, and also another to make sure work, and then I came to the ground to measure my late antagonist. From tip to tip he was 11 feet, 7.5 inches in length, the longest tiger by more than 12 inches that I have ever secured. It was fully 10 minutes from the time I sprang into the tree until the shikaree came in sight, and the longest 10 minutes I ever had in my life. End of Section 9. Recording by Danny Hogger. www.dannyhogger.com.
Section 10 of the Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paezra Utrecht. The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories by Thomas Wallace Knox. Caught in a typhoon. We were running down the coast of China from Shanghai to Hong Kong. It was in the month of August, and the southwest monsoon was blowing strong against us, so that our headway was slow. The passengers in the saloon were less than a dozen, but they represented 4 nationalities: English, French, German and American, and as all had seen a fair share of the world, we got along admirably together. The captain was a ruddy Englishman who had been in Asiatic waters for several years. The accommodations of the steamer were excellent, and altogether the voyage, until we were off the port of Amoy and some 50 miles from land, was a delightful one. I had been on deck, conning with a glass the coast of the Flowery Kingdom, the junks and other craft that studded the waters, and the play of light and wind on the sea, where the monsoon was exerting its force. Something in the appearance of one of the junks attracted my attention, and I strolled in the direction of the chart-room to ask the captain about it. He came out of the chart-room as I neared the door. The look of anxiety on his face told me that questions would not then be in order, and I refrained. He hurried along without noticing my presence, and went straight to the bridge, whence he shouted some kind of an order through the speaking tube that led to the engineer's room.
Then he called for the first and second officers, and they speedily went to the bridge and reported for duty.
"What's the matter?" I asked of the third officer, who was superintending the relashing of one of the boats on the starboard side of the ship. "Matter enough. You'll find out for yourself in an hour or two. We'll have a typhoon on us before long, unless the signs are wrong." Then he turned his attention to the work before him, and I went below to observe the aneroid barometer hanging in the saloon. I had looked at it within 2 hours and mentally noted how it then stood. It had fallen rapidly since my observation, and as I tapped gently on the glass front, the dial descended perceptibly. In the regions and season of the typhoons, one of these fearful storms is foretold by a rapid fall of the barometer, and a careful mariner keeps a sharp watch on that instrument from beginning to end of the nautical day. Soon I was on deck again, and found the wind had increased and its direction changed several points. The course of the steamer was altered so as to bring the wind on the port beam, and thus carry the vessel away from the center of the storm. In the northern hemisphere, the typhoon whirls in a direction opposite to that of the hands of a clock, from right to left, while in the southern hemisphere it turns from left to right. Typhoon, great wind, is only the oriental name for a cyclone or hurricane. It is a circular storm from 50 to 500 miles in diameter, and has a motion over the surface of the earth or water in addition to its whirling motion.
Spin a top rapidly, and while it is spinning let it move along the floor or pavement. This is an exact illustration of the two motions of a typhoon. The nearer you get to the center, the more violent is the wind, and hence the effort of a ship caught in a typhoon to sail toward the circumference. There is a general, though not universal, belief that a typhoon has a calm center a few miles in diameter. This belief is earnestly supported by some mariners, and as earnestly opposed by others. So, too, is the theory that if a ship is once caught in the center of a typhoon, she can never get out of it. Steadily, the wind increased and the clouds became more and more dense. Everything about the ship was made as fast as possible, but in spite of all the lashing, several articles were torn away and carried off into the seething waters. I had expected to see the waves run mountain high, but they did nothing of the kind. The force of the wind was so great that waves could not form other than in that broken shape which we call a choppy sea. Even the choppy sea disappeared after a time, and the waters were blown flat, just as you may see them on a small lake or pond swept by a gust of wind. The wind was blowing fully 80 miles an hour. Fortunate indeed is it that the sea is smooth in a typhoon, as no ship that was ever built could withstand the force of such a high wind and a high sea at the same time. The sky darkened, the air was hot and stifling in spite of the rate at which the wind was blowing, and soon the rain fell in torrents. Everybody on deck was lashed to something, or clung with all his strength to prevent being blown overboard, and it occurred to me that the passengers would be safer below than above. Just as the thought came around, the captain gave the order for us to descend, and the cabin doors were soon closed upon us and securely lashed. Then we watched for a time through the bull's-eye windows the effect of the wind upon the waters, but the spray and rain were so dense that very little could be seen. After a while we gathered about the saloon table. The vessel was rolling and pitching so fearfully that we had to cling to the table and chairs in order to retain our places. We could hear the roaring of the wind, the swishing of the waters, the patter of the rain on the deck, and every few moments the steamer was tossed upward, as though in a blanket in the hands of 1,000 giants. One sound was most grateful to our ears, and that was the throb of the engine, which told that our machinery was intact. Nay, it was feeling rather than sound. The roar of the wind was so great, the chook-chook of the engine was drowned, and the pulsation was only perceptible through the trembling of our chairs and of the floor on which our feet rested. Half the time the screw seemed to be out of the water, and then it raced fearfully. As it plunged again, it slowed almost to stopping, and made our hearts rise in our throats, lest it might not start again. Cards were proposed by one of the party, but nobody else eared to play, and evidently that individual was not at all sorry that his proposal was rejected.
Then we fell to telling stories of adventure. We had done a good deal of that hitherto during the voyage, and some of the narrations had bordered on the miraculous. No one had ventured to suggest that affidavits should be attached to each of the anecdotes detailed, but I am bound to say that it needed a stomach of the very highest capacity to swallow them all. But here in the Typhoon there was a tendency to tone them, so our party in the cabin developed a regard for truthfulness, when the chances were so many that we should be at the bottom of the China Sea before sunset. In our party was a German, a handsome, vigorous man who had taken little part in the conversation thus far in the voyage. Consequently, the rest of us were a trifle surprised when he was the first to speak after the one whose adventure had just been narrated had paused. "I've been overboard in a typhoon," said he, "and with no land in sight." "Tell us about it," said half a dozen of us, almost in the same breath. "It was 10 years ago," he continued, "between Bangkok and Hong Kong. I was on a German schooner that had been trading in the Gulf of Siam and was on her way to Hong Kong. We were caught in a typhoon about 100 miles off Hong Kong, and were in the worst of it. All our yard sails were carried away, our masts went by the board, and the wind finally turned us on our beam ends. Everybody who wasn't lashed fast was carried into the sea and swept away in an instant. I was one of those who went overboard, and with me went a handkerchief, which I managed to seize as it drifted past me. The wind carried it so rapidly that it fairly dragged me as a boat is towed at the stern of a steamboat. If I had not clutched it at the instant I did, it would have gone so fast that I could not have reached it by swimming. In a minute or so after going over the rail, I could see nothing of the schooner, neither could I see any of my companions who were with me in the water. The rope by which the handkerchief had been lashed was still fastened to it, and I managed to pass it under my arm so that it gave me some support. And all the time the wind was blowing fearfully. I was blinded by the spray and the torrents of rain, and really I did not expect to live an hour where I was. Half the time my head was under water, and it was very difficult to get breath. But I clung with desperation, as a drowning man always clings to any sort of support. The water was warm, so that I was in no danger of being chilled and benumbed, at least not for a while. By and by the wind fell a little, then a little more, and then I tightened the rope under my arms and lifted myself further out of the water. A terrible thirst came upon me, but I managed to assuage it a little by catching in my mouth some of the raindrops as they fell. Then my strength began to fail. I felt like fainting, and well knew that if I became insensible I should certainly drown. As I was making a great effort to rouse myself, I caught sight of a steamer coming through the mist almost directly toward me. The lookout forward saw the handkerchief. Then he made out that a man was fast to it. Then the steamer slacked her speed so as to bring me close alongside. It was still too rough for lowering a boat. A Malay sailor came down the rope like a cat, passed the bight of it around me, and then, after casting off the handkerchief, he scrambled back again, and I was hauled on board. I fainted then, but that did no harm. I was on the steamer Danube, and her captain Clancy took good care of me and landed me safe in Hong Kong. The schooner and all the rest belonging to her were never heard from. End of section 10. Recording by Ezra Utrecht.
Section 11 of The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Matthew Thompson from www.scribblings.blog. The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories by Thomas Wallace Knox. Chapter 11. Chased by Wolves. One of the sports of certain parts of Russia during the winter season is that of hunting wolves. The amusement is conducted in a variety of ways. Sometimes, when the party of hunters is a large one, a grand battue is arranged and a wide extent of territory is surrounded. The circle may be miles in diameter, and require a day or two to form it. The territory enclosed is generally one where wolves are known to abound, and when the lines are shut and the animals driven to the centre, they frequently number 100 or more. At a hunt in Lithuania, one of the western provinces of Russia, some years ago, nearly 300 wolves were killed and half as many escaped before the lines were closed. Near St. Petersburg, wolves are more scarce, and sometimes the hunters return without any trophies. A funny story is told of an imperial wolf hunt during the reign of Nicholas. A German prince of considerable importance was visiting the court of the emperor and received many attentions. He was shown all the curiosities of the capital and its surroundings, and as a climax, the emperor determined to treat him to a wolf hunt. The guest had some reputation as a Nimrod, and consequently his host did not wish to disappoint him in finding game. The superintendent of the forest said there was a scarcity of wolves, and so His Majesty ordered a dozen or more tame ones to be let loose. Of course the chase was successful, and the game was so driven that the prince was able to bring back a couple of wolf skins on the return to the city. The emperor complimented the prince on his success, and the latter replied, "You have a strange race of wolves in Russia. One of those I killed today wore a collar, and the other one had hair rubbed from his neck, as if by a chain." All through Russia, from the Baltic to Bering Sea, the wolf can be found. He is the ordinary grey wolf of Europe and America, and only dangerous when hunger has made him fierce. In Siberia, he rarely attacks man, and during a sleigh ride of 3,600 miles through Siberia and the eastern portion of European Russia, I encountered but a few of them. One afternoon, just at sunset, a group of them looked over a snowy ridge near the road and set up a howl as if they proposed pursuing us. We drove along as rapidly as we could, and I kept my eyes fixed on the ridge until the grey coats of those brutes were altogether lost to sight. While tossing that night through my first slumber, as the sleigh was steadily dashing to the westward, I dreamed of wolves, and awoke with a feeling of great relief at my escape from being eaten up to satisfy the hungry pack of 100 or so of the most unpleasant beasts it was ever a man's misfortune to encounter. Siberia is so thinly settled, and game is so abundant, that a wolf can make an honest living much easier than in western Russia. Even in the worst winters, he is rarely driven to the necessity of pursuing travellers to obtain a meal, as there is usually a sufficient quantity of deer, antelope, and the like to be had for the hunting. In the regions of the Altai Mountains and the level country beyond them, the wolves are numerous and often seen hunting in packs or droves. A Russian officer who travelled there told me that he one day came across a pack of wolves that had surrounded a wild bull they had evidently been pursuing for some time. They had succeeded in hamstringing him, and he was certain to yield before long. My friend watched the wolves for nearly an hour, and saw that they regularly relieved each other in dangerous positions, and while some rested, the others continued to worry about their prey. The bull fought with desperation, though he seemed quite conscious of his impending fate. The gentleman shot 2 of the wolves and drove away the rest. He then put the bull out of his misery, and as he moved away, he saw the pack returning to enjoy their expected feast. Wolf hunts are most popular in the western provinces of Russia, where the population is more dense than in Siberia, and the wolves consequently grow more desperate in severe winters. The wolves pursue travellers only after severe and long continued storms that cover or drive away most of the game in the forests. The object of their pursuit are the horses that draw the sleigh rather than the persons within it, but when they have overtaken a vehicle, they are not apt to make nice distinctions between horses and men. They generally make their attacks upon the horses first, and sometimes, where a party has 4 or 5 horses, it cuts one loose from the team and then kills him, so that while the wolves are feeding upon his carcass, the chase will be delayed. I heard in Russia a story of a party near Vilna that was once pursued by wolves and in great danger of capture. There was a young woman and her lover in the sleigh, and as the wolves came close upon them, the lover proposed to jump from the sleigh and sacrifice himself in order that his affianced might escape. She refused his offer and declared that she would die with him. He finally succeeded in extorting from her a promise that she would remain in the sleigh under the guidance of the driver and endeavour, in the case of her escape, to comfort his parents in their old age. As the wolves came nearer and almost touched the sleigh, the young man sprang out among them and was instantly torn into pieces. The woman remained in obedience to her promise, and with a mingled feeling of fright and grief, cowered beneath the robes. But as the wolves again approached, she raised her head, and pronouncing the name of her lover, stood erect in the vehicle. The driver, busy with his horses, gave her no attention until she leaped among the pursuing beasts and followed the fate of the man who claimed her affection as his own. The ordinary mode of hunting wolves in Russia is to go out with a sleigh drawn by 3 horses abreast and make a circuit through the forest where the game is known to abound. Great care is taken to have the harness and everything else about the concern in good condition so that no accident may occur at a critical moment. The team of 3 horses is called a troika, and the term is applied to the animals exclusive or inclusive of the sleigh, exactly as the word team is used in America. There are usually 2 hunters in the sleigh, while the driver is perched on the seat at the forward end and has no duties beyond attending to his horses, and the hunters are armed with guns that admit of being loaded and fired rapidly, and for this purpose some of the new breech-loading weapons of the present day are found very serviceable. An important though unwilling member of the hunting party is a pig. He is taken into the sleigh and carefully wrapped up in the furs and the straw at the bottom while on the way to the happy hunting ground, but when arrived there his treatment becomes very unpleasant. He is then thrown overboard, and as the vehicle moves along he is towed astern, very much as a patent log is made to follow a ship at sea. Of course he squeals, as any other pig would do under the circumstances, and his scream on the still night air can be heard a long distance. A wolf is no Muslim or Jew, so far as the matter of eating and drinking goes. On the contrary, he is very fond of pork, and never omits an opportunity to obtain it. As he hears the scream of the pig, he is sure to be aroused by it, and if hungry, as he generally is, he moves very promptly in its direction. If the winter is severe and game scarce, the squealing of the pig is especially attractive and draws an audience as appreciative, though not as desirable, as any that ever gathered to listen to Paddy or Nilsson. When the wolves approach within easy shooting distance, the hunters make quick work with their guns, and generally succeed in bringing down quite a number. Of course this kind of hunting is as precarious as any other, and very often the hunter returns empty-handed. A dozen wolves is considered very fair shooting for a single night, and when the prizes amounts to 20 or more, it is considered a good time for wolves. One day during my stay in Irkutsk, I went with a Russian officer of my acquaintance to look at the country, a few miles north of the town. As we were returning from our ride, I spoke of a very large wolf skin that I saw at a peasant's house where we stopped a few moments to take tea. My companion became less talkative than usual as soon as I mentioned the wolf skin, and we finished our ride as if we were not on the best of terms. That evening, as we sat over our cigars, he referred to the subject of my afternoon's remark, and then told me a story, which I will give, as nearly as possible, in his own words. "You see," said he, "that though I am a young man, my hair is grey as that of a man of 60. It was not turned white in a single night, but it was turned by the events of a single night that I shall never forget. I never see a wolf or hear one mentioned without a very unpleasant feeling. When you spoke of that skin today, you touched the old wound, and it was for that reason I was so moody and little inclined to talk on our way home. 5 years ago this winter, I was in St. Petersburg, where I had just received my commission in one of the regiments attached to the immediate service of the Emperor. There was little to do, and I passed much time in the society of the gay capital. In the course of the winter, I met a most charming young lady, the sister of one of my fellow officers, and in a few weeks we became greatly attached to each other. Our intimacy terminated in engagement, and when she left, under the escort of her brother, to spend a few weeks at the family home in Posen, I obtained leave of absence and accompanied her. Of course time passed pleasantly enough for us lovers, though it hung rather heavily upon the hands of her brother, who had no one to love, and considered a great deal of our talk the veriest nonsense in the world, as it probably was. We got up little journeys to various places in the vicinity, and had several hunting excursions without any special good fortune. Finally, my friend Raslov proposed a wolf hunt, and though I would have preferred to remain at the chateau in the company of Kristina, I consented, and we made our preparations. We prepared a troika and selected the best horses from Raslov's stable, fine, quick, sure-footed beasts, and with a driver who was unsurpassed in all that region for his skill and dash. The sleigh was a large one, and we fitted it with a good supply of robes and straw, and put a healthy young pig in it to serve as a decoy. We each had a gun, and carried a couple of spare guns with plenty of ammunition, so that we could kill as many wolves as presented themselves. Just as we were preparing to start, and the horses were prancing at the door, Kristina asked to accompany us. We didn't anticipate any danger, but somehow we felt a reluctance to expose her to whatever risk there was in the expedition. I suggested the coldness of the night, and Raslov hinted that the sleigh was too small for 3. But Kristina protested that the air, though sharp, was clear and still, and she could wrap herself warmly. A ride a few hours would do her more good than harm. The sleigh, she insisted, was a large one and afforded ample room. Besides, she added, I will sit directly behind the driver, and out of your way, and I want to see a wolf hunt very much indeed. So we consented. Kristina arrayed herself in a few moments, and we started on our excursion. The servants were instructed to hang out a light in front of the entrance to the courtyard. It was about sunset when we left the chateau, and drove out upon the plain covered here and there with patches of forest. The road we followed was well trodden by the many peasants on their way to the fair of the town, some 25 miles away. We met several parties of these peasants jogging merrily along, some of them rather too merry from deep potations of the native vodka. We travelled slowly, not wishing to tire out our horses, and as we left the half-dozen villages that clustered around the chateau within a few miles of it, we had the road entirely to ourselves. The moon rose soon after sunset, and as it was still at the full, it lightened up the plain very clearly, and seemed to stand out quite distinct from the deep blue sky and the bright stars that sparkled everywhere above the horizon. We chatted gaily as we rode along. Somehow I found it convenient to sit very close to Kristina's side, and it was not strange that it became necessary to throw my arm around her waist to support her. The time passed so rapidly that I was half surprised when Raslov told me to cease love-making and get ready to hunt wolves. Kristina thought we'd better wait a little longer, but her brother was inflexible, and so we halted and made our preparations. The pig had been lying very comfortably in the bottom of the sleigh, and protested quite loudly as we brought him out. The rope had been made ready before we started from home, and so the most we had to do was turn the horses around, get our guns ready, and throw the pig upon the ground. He set up a piercing shriek as the rope dragged him along and completely drowned out our voices. Paul had hard work to keep the horses from breaking into a run, but he succeeded, and we maintained a very slow trot. Kristina nestled into the place she'd agreed to occupy, and Raslov and I prepared to shoot the wolves. We drove thus for 15 or 20 minutes. The pig gradually became exhausted and reduced his scream to a sort of moan that was very painful to hear. I began to think we should see no wolves and return to the chateau without firing our guns, when suddenly a howl came faintly along the air, and in a moment another and another. "There!" said Raslov. "There comes our game, and we shall have work enough before long." A few moments later, I saw a half-dozen dusky forms emerging from the forest, to the right and behind us. They seemed like moving spots on the snow, and had it not been for their howling, I should have failed to notice them as early as I did. They grew more and more numerous, and as they gathered behind us, formed a waving line across the road that gradually took the shape of a crescent, with the horns pointing towards our right and left. At first, they were timid, and kept 100 yards or more behind us, but as soon as the hog renewed his screams, they took courage and approached nearer. By the time they were within 50 yards, there were 200 or 300 of them, possibly 500. I could see every moment that their numbers were increasing, and it was somewhat impatiently that I waited Raslov's signal to fire. At last he told me to begin, and I fired at the centre of the pack. The wolf I struck gave a howl of pain, and his companions, roused by the smell of blood, fell upon him and tore him to pieces in a moment. Razloff fired an instant after me, and then we kept our firing up as fast as possible. As the wolves fell, the others sprang upon them, but the pack was so large that they were not maternally detained by stopping to eat up their brethren. They continued the pursuit, and what alarmed me, they came nearer and showed very little fear of our guns. We had taken a large quantity of ammunition, more by half than we thought would possibly be needed, but its quantity diminished so rapidly as to suggest the probability of exhaustion. The pack steadily came nearer. We cut the pig away, but it stopped the pursuit for only a moment. Directly behind us, the wolves were not 10 yards away. On each side, they were no further from the horses, who were snorting with fear and requiring all the efforts of the driver to hold them. We shot down the beasts as fast as possible, and as I saw our danger, I whispered my thoughts to Razloff. He replied to me in Spanish, which Kristina did not understand, that the situation was really dangerous, and we must prepare to get out of it. I would stay longer, he suggested, though there's a good deal of risk in it, but we must think of the girl and not let her suspect anything wrong, and above all, must not risk her safety. Turning to the driver, he said in a cheery tone, Paul, we have shot till we're tired out. You may let the horses go, but keep them well in control. Even when he spoke, a huge wolf sprang from the pack and dashed towards one of the horses. Another followed him, and in 20 seconds the line was broken and they were upon us. One wolf jumped at the rear of the sleigh and caught his paws upon it. Razloff struck him with the butt of his gun, and at the same instant he delivered the blow. Paul let the horses have their way. Razloff fell upon the edge of the vehicle and over its side. Luckily his foot caught in one of the robes and held him for an instant, long enough to enable me to seize and draw him back. It was the work a moment, but what a moment! Kristina had remained silent, suspecting but not fully comprehending our danger. As her brother fell, she gave one piercing scream and dropped senseless to the bottom of the sleigh. I confess that I exerted all my strength in that effort to save the brother of my affianced, and as I accomplished it, I sat powerless, though still conscious, at the side of the girl I loved. Razloff's right arm was dislocated by the fall, and one of the pursuing wolves had struck his teeth into his scalp as he was dragging over the side, and torn it so that it bled profusely. How narrow had been his escape. Faster! Faster, Paul! He shouted. Drive for your life and for ours. Paul gave the horses free rein, and they needed no urging. They dashed along the road as horses rarely have ever dashed before. In a few minutes I gained strength enough to raise my head and saw to my unspeakable delight that the distance between us and the pack was increasing. We were safe if no accident occurred, and the horses could maintain their pace. One horse fell, but as if knowing his danger, made a tremendous effort and gained his feet. By and by we saw the light at the chateau, and in a moment dashed into the courtyard, and we were safe. We carried Kristina to the house, but it was several hours before she recovered her consciousness. A peasant told us that the road we followed was strewn with the wolves we had killed, but we did not care to visit the scene of our horrible danger. Razloff soon recovered from his injuries, but his hair, like mine, turned white from the date of that fearful ride. Kristina and I were married a few months later, but none of us ever refer, except by accident, to the wolf hunt in Possum. End of chapter 11. Recorded by Matthew Thompson from www.scribblings.blog.
Section 12 of The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anthony Castellani. The Talking Handkerchief and Other Stories by Thomas Wallace Knox. Betrayed by a Mirage. In the early part of the present century, Muhammad Ali Pasha, the ruler of Egypt, sent an army to conquer Nubia. It was necessary for this army to march across a part of the desert which is enclosed in a wide bend of the Nile, between Korosko and Abu Hamid, a distance, as the road runs, of about 240 miles. There is only a single place in all this distance where wells or springs can be found. Troops and all other travelers must carry a supply of water, and use great precautions to prevent its waste, and even with all the care they can exercise, there is frequently great suffering. The road can be traced by the skeletons of men and animals that have died of thirst or from the excessive heat that prevails in this locality at all seasons of the year, and in one place a few miles away from the direct route, the great number of skeletons tells a fearful story. One of the regiments of Muhammad Ali had not taken proper precautions in regard to its supply of water, and the officers discovered, to their dismay, that while they were yet a long distance from their destination on the banks of the Nile, the precious fluid was wholly exhausted. Men and animals were suffering severely, but it was hoped that by a forced march, continuing through the entire night and part of the next day, they might reach Abu Hamed, where everybody could drink to his satisfaction in the great river which gives life to Egypt. As the men were dragging themselves slowly along, there appeared, away to the east and at a right angle to the road, the shining waters of a lake. Those who first saw it cried out, "Moya, Moya! Water, water," and the cry was quickly carried along the line. The weary were encouraged, the pace of all was quickened, and the head of the column turned in the direction where the lake spread its inviting surface. In vain did the officers try to stop the men by ordering them to continue their route, and telling them there was no lake at all, but only a deception. Maddened with thirst, the soldiers broke through all discipline, threw down their arms, and each for himself sought to reach the welcome water as soon as possible. All control was lost, and even some of the officers joined in the mad flight. As they went on, the lake seemed to withdraw further and further away, and at length it disappeared altogether, and the men fell to the ground exhausted and in despair. The lake was a cruel deception of nature, and in its stead they found only the stony and sandy desert, with not a trace of the water they so much needed for the preservation of their lives. Only a few of the soldiers had sufficient strength to return to the route and continue the march to Abu Hamed. All the others died where they fell, and their skeletons, where not covered by the drifting sands, are still whitening the desert and telling the story of the work of the mirage. The mirage on the deserts of Egypt was first made known to the Western world by Professor Monge, who accompanied Napoleon's expedition to that country. On several occasions, the soldiers at the head of the marching column were deceived by the appearance of water directly along the road where they expected to march, and once the column was halted and ordered to form in line for battle, as a strong force of the enemy was seen approaching with every appearance of an intention to oppose the further advance of the French. As the French troops formed in line, it was seen that the others did the same. As the cavalry dismounted, so did the cavalry of the enemy. As the cannon were wheeled into position, the Arabs brought forward an equal number of guns. One of the officers proceeded to examine the enemy with a telescope and, to his great surprise, found that they were in French uniforms and imitated every movement of the Napoleonic forces with the most complete exactness. An Arab guide was at the officer's side, preserving the grave silence for which the Arabs are noted. When his opinion was asked, he briefly said that the opposing army was all in the air and nothing more than a mirage. "If you advance," said he, "it will retreat, and in a little while will fly away out of sight." The order to advance was given. Sure enough, the imaginary army fell back and soon vanished altogether. It was one of the tricks of the mirage, which had created the image of the French army, just as the mirror reflects our faces as we stand before it. Deceptions of this sort are less frequent than those of the ordinary mirage which creates lakes, rivers, and forests where none exist, or raises into full view objects that are really far below the horizon. The scientific explanation of the mirage is based on the varying densities of different strata of air, owing to the effect of the sun's rays, which produce an unusual refraction. Everybody knows that the brook or river is deeper than it seems to be to the eye, and that a stick or oar thrust into the water on a bright day seems to be shortened and also bent at the point where it enters. This appearance comes from refraction, and it is the same cause that gives us the mirage. While the mirage often causes disaster or disappointment, it is quite as often a matter of advantage. In the Arctic regions, it is no uncommon thing for a whale ship to learn the position of another that is really far beyond the horizon by seeing its reflection in the air. In such a case, the image is usually inverted, but sometimes a double image is seen, one of the figures being upright and the other inverted. In Captain Scoresby's Arctic expedition, his two ships became separated, but the captain subsequently ascertained the position of the other ship by seeing it reflected in the sky, when it was actually 17 miles beyond the line of the horizon. It is said that a French fleet was once preparing for a descent on the English coast during one of the wars that prevailed between France and England. The preparations had been made with great secrecy, and the hostile fleet was to assemble at a point 50 miles from the shore selected for the attack. When all was ready, and it took several days to assemble the hostile ships, the advance was made with the expectation of taking the English by surprise. But the surprise was on the other side, as the mirage had revealed the distant fleet on the day when it began to meet. Every ship was shown inverted in the air for more than 3 hours, and the movements were such that the English officers readily understood that a rendezvous had been ordered at that point. Men for the defense were gathered as rapidly as possible. The forts were manned and put in readiness, and when the French fleet came sailing in, it met with a reception as warm as it was unexpected. I once heard the officer of an American ship of war tell the following story of how his vessel captured a slave ship on the coast of Africa through the aid of the mirage. We were cruising along the coast on the hunt for slavers, and had not seen anything for some time. The weather was frightfully hot, and many of the men were ill in consequence, so that the commander decided to put into Sierra Leone for a while to give us a respite from full duty, and let us have a run on shore from time to time. We squared away in the direction of that port, and everybody breathed freer at the prospect of a rest. We were under sail, our engines being stopped and the fires put out, except when a slave ship was in sight. The orders were that we should save coal wherever possible, and in obedience to the orders, coal was never burned, except where the necessity for it was imperative. About noon of the second day after we headed for Sierra Leone, the lookout reported a sail. An officer went to the cross trees immediately with the most powerful telescope on the ship, and made her out a slaver stealing away from the coast. She was headed directly for the open Atlantic, and had all the appearance of a slave ship with a cargo of human beings for the Cuban or Brazilian market. We laid our course so as to head her off, and got up steam as soon as we could, but a stern chase is a long chase. She sailed well, and with all our efforts, she was 6 or 8 miles away when night fell and hid her from our sight. How we wished and wished for a few hours more of daylight. You may be sure that our wishes were exactly the reverse of all the crew of that slave ship, as capture meant death to them, with the exception of those who could clearly prove that they had been unwillingly forced into the nefarious business. Night was a shield for the slaver, as it enabled her to change her course wherever she wished, as long as the wind favored her. In the morning she might be out of sight, and we could only guess in what direction she lay. We banked the fires and went along under easy sail, just enough to give steerage way, and no more. Toward morning the wind died out, so that we slowed down to a knot an hour. Everybody was out of temper, and we felt that we had lost the chance of taking a prize into port, and quite likely of releasing several hundred Negroes from captivity. I was sent aloft to watch from the cross trees in the forlorn hope of catching a sight of the slaver. As the day broke, I swept the horizon in every direction, and after satisfying myself that the man-stealer had quite eluded us, I went below and reported to the officer of the day. Then I returned to my post, again and again scanned the curving rim of the ocean, with always the same result. In the east was the low, thin haze that marked the coast of Africa, but there was not a speck of sail between me and the haze, while north, south, and west nothing could be seen save sea and sky. A young midshipman had gone aloft with me, and there we remained during the whole of the morning watch, hoping against hope to find out where to go to catch the slaver. I offered him a gold moidore if he could discover her, but he did not need any financial stimulus, as he was quite as eager as all the rest to locate the prize. Of course, our observation was naturally ahead of us, rather than in the other direction, but we did not leave any quarter of the horizon without careful examination. Neither of us thought to turn his gaze to the sky, and it was only by accident that the midshipman cast his eyes in that direction, almost over our stern. Suddenly he gave an exclamation that attracted my attention, and then said, "I'll have that gold moidore, Mr. Blank, before the day is out." "I hope you will," I answered, "but just now there's no chance for it." "Excuse me, sir, but I think there is," he answered. And then he pointed to the sky over our stern, about 20 degrees above the horizon. There was the slaver, hull, sails, and all, inverted in the air and so clearly defined that there was no mistaking her. I swept the horizon just below her, and not a sign of her could be seen. The telltale mirage had revealed her when her captain and crew were probably laughing at having outwitted the Yankee ship of war. I sent the middy below to report, and a proud fellow he was, you may believe. The fires were started in short order, full steam was made, and away we went for Mr. Slaver at our best speed. The wind died out altogether and left her helpless. We sighted her inside of 2 hours, and in 5 hours from the time we saw her image in the sky, she was in our possession. The captain thought he had outwitted us completely by steering back during the night along the course we had come. When he first caught sight of us, he rightly surmised that we were bound for Sierra Leone, and nothing would be more natural than for us to continue on our course after losing sight of the slaver. We continued on to Sierra Leone, but not in the manner he had expected. Instead of being alone, we had company, that of the slaver with a prize crew on board. Her own crew were ironed and secured on board our ship, and in due course of time they met the fate they deserved. There were 300 slaves on board, and these were set at liberty as soon as the port was reached. Some of them found relatives and friends among those who had preceded them. Sierra Leone had received a good many cargoes of liberated slaves, and continued to do so until the slave trade on the west coast of Africa was altogether suppressed. End of Section 12. Recording by Anthony Castellani.